I'm a girl. My mom was a horrible addict. She barely took care of me as a kid. At the time of this incident, I was around 6 or 7, so my awareness and understanding of things happening may not totally make much sense. This happened in the 90s. One night my mother and I were on a car ride. I wasn't sure why we were driving, but it was late at night. I'm not really sure what time it was, but I assume really late because there weren't many cars on the street and I was asleep in the back seat. I don't even remember getting in the car. My mom drove up to some sketchy house and left me in the car for what felt like forever. Suddenly the car door swung open and someone violently grabbed me by my arm and yanked me out of the car. I started screaming and crying until the man that grabbed me looked me in the eyes and said, "Be quiet and don't try to run or I'll kill you." He had a scruffy beard and looked like a madman. I was scared to death, so I listened. He held me tight by my arm, shut the car door, and walked me down the street. I looked back at the house my mom was in, hoping that my mom would come out at the last second and save me. I looked at the house as long as I could as the man dragged me further and further away. As we walked down the street, I wanted to cry, but I was in shock. I didn't know what to do. If I sniffled or cried, the man would tighten his grip and yell at me. I can't even explain how scared and confused I was. We walked for a little while and ended up in the projects. The projects were a bunch of buildings crammed together in a shitty neighborhood. We walked into one of the buildings and walked up a flight of stairs. My legs and feet hurt like hell, but I was too scared to stop moving or complain. We walked up another flight of stairs when I saw some random guy smoking a cigarette in the stairway. Then, without warning, the guy who kidnapped me fell to the ground. It happened so fast. I didn't know how the kidnapper fell to the ground so fast, but the next thing I remember is the cigarette guy punching and kicking the kidnapper in his head and face. The kidnapper was out cold. Cigarette guy picked up the kidnapper by the back of his jacket and threw him down the stairs. You have no idea how scary and violent it is to see an unconscious man fall down the stairs. To this day, I still have a fear of falling downstairs. He bled everywhere. I still have no idea how Cigarette Guy knew to help me, but I'm glad he did. Maybe he could see the tears in my eyes. Maybe he just picked up on something and had a bad vibe. But he acted instantly. The first second he could, he attacked my would-be kidnapper. Cigarette Guy starts pacing back and forth, swearing at himself, gritting his teeth and clenching his fists. I thought he was mad at me, so I started to cry. He looked at me and said, Okay, shut up. He had an attitude, so I listened to him out of fear. I wasn't as scared of Cigarette Guy as much as I was the bearded guy, but I still feared him. He started to ask me questions with an attitude. Why are you out this late? Where are your parents? Why would you talk to strangers? I was in so much shock and confusion I couldn't answer the man's questions correctly. He asked if I knew my way home, and I told him that I didn't. I told him a broken story about what had happened, and somehow with the information I gave him, he knew where my mom's car was. The only thing I remember about the road is passing a house with Christmas lights on it, despite Christmas already being over. I think he knew that area well enough and figured out where I needed to go from that information, but I honestly don't even remember telling him about the Christmas lights. He told me that he would take me back if I promised over and over that I wouldn't tell the police that I saw him or anyone that looked like him, and made me promise that I wouldn't even tell the police anything. He had an attitude and I didn't care what he asked, I just wanted to go back to my mom. So I agreed. I followed him down the stairs. The bearded guy was still laying on the ground bleeding at the bottom of the stairs the Cigarette Guy threw him down. He wasn't moving at all. For all I know, he was dead, and I hope now that he was. Cigarette Guy stepped over the bearded guy and I followed. We walked outside and Cigarette Guy looked around panicky. I remember him telling me, "The police don't like me." We walked our way out of the projects and my feet still hurt. Cigarette Guy was walking fast in a panic and I basically had to jog to keep up with him. I started crying and he asked what was wrong, and I told him my feet hurt, and I remember him sucking his teeth and picking me up with attitude. He awkwardly cradled me in both arms. He walked down the road for a moment, then I remembered him swearing and running behind a house or a building. A cop car was driving down the road. He put me down and told me to run to the police car. I tried to run, but my legs could barely move and I was so scared. The cop car kept driving and rode away without seeing me before I could even get remotely close to it. He kept swearing to himself as he picked me up again and ran down the street. He took me behind a lot of houses and hid from every cop car that drove by. I assumed now that the police were looking for me. He carried me in both arms, running fast down the road when I saw my mom in her car in the distance. She was surrounded by police. Cigarette guy put me down and told me to run to the police. I got so excited the pain in my legs disappeared. He put me down and ran away. I ran towards the police and my mom. My mom picked me up and hugged me tight. The police started to ask me and my mom questions. I don't remember too much about their questions, but I remember my mom telling the police some convoluted story that didn't make any sense. She basically told me not to say anything, and I didn't say much, but I cried the whole time. We then went home. Days later, my dad picked me up and knew something was wrong. I told him everything. I never lived with my mom again. When I grew up and had time to think about that day, I never forgave my mother. Not too long ago, I asked my dad about what he remembered about the situation, and he told me what he thinks happened from what I explained to him years ago. He said my mom was on a drug binge. I got kidnapped, someone saved me, but the person who saved me had warrants and wasn't mad at me, but he was just frustrated with the situation he had to deal with. Imagine being a criminal on the run and now you have a kidnapped girl with you and you just beat a guy half to death. If he would have got caught with me, he would be in jail for my kidnapping. With my mom lying and me being in shock and confused, I wouldn't have been able to tell them that the man helped me because while this was all happening, I didn't even notice he was helping me. To the man that saved me, thanks. To set the scene, our house is about 1/4 of a mile down a long driveway in the woods and completely hidden. The house and deck are built on a steep hill, so there are many places where you can walk into the house on ground floor through glass or wooden doors, but then you can go up and down flights of stairs to reach other parts of the ground floor. The same is the case for our decks. The whole thing kind of carries like a series of terraces, and I love it. Because of this, we also have several upstairs that can't be reached by one another. This means you can go upstairs to the library, but to get to my second floor room, you have to go back down the stairs, walk across the biggest ground floor section we have, and then go up a different flight of stairs. It just so happens that it makes my room hardest to get to. I've been extremely sick and out of school for a few weeks, and today I needed help. I ended up having to throw my phone against the floor, praise the case gods for working, to make enough noise to signal I needed help. After this, my dad has to stay with me on the couch in the main ground floor area. This had me right between a couple of doors to the outside. The staircase up to my room and also a staircase down to my parents' room where there was another door to walk out onto the deck and another part of the hill. And I just laid on the couch doing my thing. My mom was 100 miles away at work, and with my open bedroom door I could hear my dad rummaging through stuff. I had no idea what he was doing, but eventually it got quiet and I heard his bedroom door to the outside open and close. Almost immediately after this, the outside door on the level I was on the opposite side of the house opened and my dad walked in carrying a bag of groceries from a supermarket farther away that takes like an hour to go to. Small town life. He started talking about how he went all the way to the X store to buy me ingredients for my favorite pancake recipe and banana to slice on top, and asked if I wanted to make it now or if we should wait. I was definitely rattled, because we have 2 dogs and neither even stirred. They were in the garage the whole time, closer to where my dad actually walked in. I think he thinks I just imagined it because I've been having a really bad day handling my chemo drugs and nothing was taken. To be fair, my parents' room looks like the place where all the good things in the house are. There's even a suspicious safe. But it's all in the library. If you broke in, you'd probably search there most too, just from its overall mood. I know I would. Sorry if this was kind of long or if you're just left thinking, oh, this kid scared herself. But I wanted to share regardless of whether it was my neighbor or the wind or the boogeyman in that room. I'm deadbolting everything tonight. This happened to me when I was a child, and I still remember it very clearly to this day, as it set me up for a lifelong fear of being watched while I sleep. I was 6 years old, and me and my family were living in public housing as we had recently came to America. Our apartment was on the first floor, but slightly underground as my bedroom window was level with the ground outside. The windows were big and had a ledge. I had stuffed animals lined up looking out the window. On this specific night, I was having trouble sleeping as there were strange noises coming from outside my window along with tapping. I peeped out my window and saw a strange man crouching and peeping through a gap between my curtains and the wall, looking directly at me with a strange look on his face. I started screaming and crying, and my dad ran into the room to reassure me that everything was okay and that I was having a bad dream. But I hadn't been sleeping. I couldn't sleep that night. I was having a weird feeling the entire night as if I was being watched. My dad opened the curtains and nothing was there. To comfort me, he slept in my bed with me, but I couldn't sleep. He, on the other hand, knocked out. It was getting later in the night and the weird noises started again. It sounded like someone trying to cut through the screen and tapping on the window with the blade as he cut through with the motion. I woke my dad up quietly, trying to show him what I was talking about. He ripped open the curtain and saw the man with a knife cutting through the screen. He jumped out of bed and ran for the door and then ran to chase the man who was watching me sleep and trying to break into my room. He chased the man to his car, but he sped off before my dad had a chance to confront him. My parents called the police and told them what had happened, but nothing really came of it. From that night on, I've had an irrational fear and never slept by a window. I used to have night terrors about the incident for years. I haven't thought about it for a while now, but I had another dream about it recently, so I couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked my dad about it recently, and he refused to talk to me about it. I had been sent to Korea from my university a few years ago. They told me for my major I had to go somewhere in Asia, and my friends really talked up Korea for me. I knew nothing about it, but I decided what the hell, and I embarked on a semester-long trip. I had only had one serious boyfriend in my life, who I broke up with a few months prior. I also don't enjoy one-night stands and wasn't digging the dudes at the clubs in Seoul. But I still wanted to have some sort of romantic experience, I suppose, so my friend recommended I use a dating app to meet English-speaking Koreans. That way I could meet someone and experience the actual dating culture. I thought, I'm young, so why not? I was eager to have new experiences. Maybe it sounds dumb trying to date in a foreign country, but it worked out for me eventually. Just not the first date. I met him on a dating app after being in Seoul about 3 weeks. Let's call him Tim. I still didn't know the culture or the city very well, and was a bit naive about everything. He eagerly wanted to meet for a date after talking to me, and he seemed nice. I should have asked more questions, and I should have noticed that he was not giving me many details about himself. Tim was a guy a bit older than me, but he claimed he was a college student. I assumed he had done his military time, all men in Korea have to, and returned to school. We talked for a bit and decided to meet for a tea date near the school I went to. He wanted to come to my dorm originally to pick me up, but I live in an all-women's dorm and didn't want him to know exactly where I lived since he was still a stranger. So instead, I insisted we meet by the main town center near the subway. He really didn't like this idea, which, looking back, was a red flag. But eventually, I insisted. The night of the date, I waited an hour for this guy. He was very late. Tim weirdly claimed he just wanted to make me wait. I thought he was kidding and messaged him with a laughing emoji, assuming he was just lost. When he finally arrived, he was much smaller than I thought, but a man's height had never been something I cared much about. He was also quite thin. Maybe I let my guard down because I didn't see him as physically threatening to me, which was a mistake in the end. Right off the bat, he was way too touchy-feely with me, and breathed creepy and heavy. I was so put off by his demeanor. I'm usually very tolerant with different personality types, but this was very odd to me. I had been told that Korean men might be polite and not so touchy on the first date. He was also dressed oddly, like in business attire for a date, but I thought maybe it's just a Korean thing. Again, I was dumb and knew jack shit about the culture. Then the first thing he said to me was, "You're not as white as I thought you were." I thought this was a translation error, but his English was near perfect. So I asked for clarification, and he said what I thought he meant. "I thought you would be more white. Your skin is darker than I thought, and your eyes aren't as green. Are you pure European?" Now I was officially weirded out. First of all, I'm pretty much as white as you can get. I'm Irish and Scandinavian, so white as hell basically. So the fact that he thought I could have possibly been whiter was funny. And why did he care in the first place? Why does my skin color matter to this guy? And why is he bringing it up? He said about 3 times on the date how he wished I had greener eyes. And every time I would just reply, "Well, maybe my online photo makes me look brighter," and brushed it off as him being nervous and trying to start a conversation. Isn't it funny the dumb excuses you make for people when you're panicked? When we arrived at the tea place, I tried to order a basic raspberry tea, and he stopped me and told me that I had to have this special tea. I thought it was weird he wanted to choose my tea for me, but in my head I brushed it off once again. He really insisted I drink only this tea type, and I just agreed. These small details become weirder later. After tea, he asked if we could look around my school. It was dark, but the school is very well lit, so I agreed, and the whole time we walked around, he would randomly stop and grab me for long hugs. At first, I let it happen, but then I stopped him, and he kept trying. He kept grabbing me and breathing hard into my neck. It was so awkward. He also would not tell me any personal details about himself. I asked him so many questions, desperately trying to distract from all the awkward grabbing and try to get to know him. But he would never tell me anything. He even said at one point, "I'm a mysterious man," like a movie line. He also said something like, "You look so much like my favorite movie character." And I asked too, but he said that I would have to figure that out on my own. Finally, he said, "I want to go to a dark area." And in my head I screamed, "Hell no!" At this point I wanted the date over fast. He somehow knew there was a wooded area behind my campus and he said we should go there. I said no and that I wanted to stay near the main campus in town. But he kept pushing. Finally he grabbed my arm and started dragging me there. He said, "I can't let anyone see." And I started to panic. I finally ripped my arm away and just demanded we leave and go back to the main road immediately. Looking back, I don't know why I didn't ask for help or get angry. Maybe I was scared, but I just began to book it back to the main road and he followed. We ended up in front of a hospital near the center of town and I told him it was time for him to go. I made some excuse and he was pleading with me to stay. I told him we could meet the next day and I would message him. I lied. I just wanted to get away at this point. I was pretending it was all okay just so he would leave. Suddenly, I think he's leaning in to kiss me, and I immediately think, God, no. But it was so much worse. Instead, I feel a pain in my face. It takes me a second to realize he was biting my face. It was like a dog. I'd never felt that sensation before. He leaned his head sideways and bit me on my nose and my cheek as hard as he could. I screamed and pushed him away from me. His face looked so freaky and I barely had time to react in words. Instead, I ran up the sidewalk until I saw a convenience store on the right. I ran to the back of the store and bent down to start crying. The man who owned the store started to yell at me, but I couldn't explain my situation. I just begged him in English to let me stay. I ended up having to buy a popsicle to stick around. God, I wish I had learned some Korean by then. I guess Tim didn't follow me. I peered outside the store and didn't see him. I texted a friend and waited for them to come get me to take me back to my dorm. On the way, I messaged him and basically told him to stay away from me. I told him he was a creep and that he shouldn't bite women, and something along the lines of calling the police, and then I blocked him. I was so scared to walk around my school after that. I was so afraid he would find me somehow. I am so thankful I didn't let him pick me up at my dorm. I called my mom to tell her what had happened when suddenly she was like, "Wait, what did he ask you?" She then put some details together and realized that all these weird things had to do with the 50 Shades of Grey books. At first I thought I was just being silly and overthinking a bad date. I thought she was joking, but oh God, she was right. She had recently seen the movie or read the book of something and knew the details. The eye color and the way he dressed and the tea he had me drink and the random lines he said, it all matched the books and movies. For his dirty little fantasy. My mom thinks he picked me because I looked like the girl in the movie to him. It explains why he was so fixated on my appearance. And this whole thing with biting and trying to dominate me. Even if it wasn't his intention, I later learned that there are some few creeps who like to seek foreign girls to dominate and have sex with them like a prize. They call it riding the white horse or something along those lines. On a happier note, this bad experience didn't stop me. I eventually met someone else in Korea and we ended up falling in love. We even did the whole long distance thing, and now I'm living in Korea studying and working. Hoping to marry soon. So I guess I didn't let the bad creepy guys stop my life. In 2011, my cousin, his pregnant fiancée, and myself went to buy some weed at an unknown drug spot in Detroit. When we got to the location, it was known to you had to make a noise to get the dealer's attention. Yelling, "Whoop whoop!" No one came outside. So we kept driving. We get to the next street and a group of guys flagged us down. I told my cousin to keep going, but he wouldn't listen. What started off as my cousin talking about buying a couple grams of weed turned into him talking about buying a whole prescription worth of painkillers. So the main guy in the group tells my cousin to park his car next to a field and he'll come back with the pills. While waiting, everything just felt weird, as though the situation didn't seem right. The main guy and the other guy came back and told my cousin he would have to give him the cash because the person he was running the pills for wouldn't do the deal without the money. It was at that time my cousin knew something wasn't right and said, "Fuck that. This sounds like a setup." He went to start his car, and right when the engine cranked over, the man put a gun to my cousin's head and reached into the car and took the keys out of the ignition. The main guy said, "Give me that money. I'm not fucking playing." My cousin reached in his pocket and gave the guy a $100 bill and said, "That's all I have." My cousin's girlfriend frantically crying as my cousin kept pretending he gave the man all of his money. The main guy said to her, "Oh baby, I'm not gonna hurt you. As soon as he gives us the money, everything will be okay." The main guy hands his buddy his gun and then starts punching my cousin in the face and starts sticking his hands in my cousin's pockets. His friend was holding the gun by 2 fingers as though he wanted no part of it. It was so surreal. It was like I was distracting myself from everything going on and stayed as quiet as possible. I had my phone out acting like I was playing games. Then it occurred to me that if they saw my phone in my hands, they would assume I was calling the police. So I closed the phone. The main guy then addressed me and asked me if I had anything. I immediately flipped my pockets inside out and handed him my empty wallet and cell phone. After that, my cousin asked if he could at least have his keys back. The man gave him his keys back and said, "If you ever come back here, I will kill you." The man and his friend regrouped with all the people they were with originally. My cousin started driving away. We get 3/4 of the way down the street when he turns around in someone's driveway. I had no clue what was going through his head or why he would have turned around. As he was going back towards the people that had robbed us, he starts speeding. My cousin steered the car right into the group of people who robbed us. All of them jumped out of the way except the main guy who robbed us. He flew up and hit the windshield, his body immediately shattering the entire windshield. The airbags went off and the car swerved really hard from the impact and hit a curb and broke the control arm. Smoke was rising from the front of the car and we were broke down in the hood with what looked like a dead man still on the hood of our car. My cousin attempted to restart the car. As he kept trying to start the car, his fiancée kept repeating, "Oh my God, we're gonna die," while crying. After his failed attempt to get the car to start, he looked at me and his fiancée and said, "Get out and run." My cousin was the first one out. I was not familiar with his car and struggled finding the door handle. I had climbed to the front of the vehicle and waited for his fiancée to get out. I got out of the car and started running as fast as I could. His fiancée looked at me as I was outrunning her and said, "Help me." I remembered the man trying to comfort her as he robbed us and felt they wouldn't harm her. I reassured her, "It's okay, you're gonna be just fine, just keep running." And I kept running. Just after that, I saw a man behind me with a pipe in his hand chasing me. I had one more street to go before I could jump the fence to the service drive and flag cars down for help on the freeway. But unluckily for me, that didn't happen. The man caught up to me and hit me in the back of the head with his pipe, and I kept going. Then the man hit me in the side of the head with his pipe, and I went down. The man got on top of me and asked, "Why did you do that?" Then he hit me with the pipe. I told him I didn't and said, "I was a passenger in the back seat." He then said, "Wait till the cops get here," and then hit me with the pipe again. He asked me where my cousin went, and I pointed to the opposite way he ran. Then another man approaches while he was on top of me. He looks at the other man and says, "Smoke him." I knew what it meant and knew at least one person in that group of men had a gun, and I started to wiggle backwards as a last attempt to try to get away. It was at that time I thought my life was going to end. It wasn't like the movies when you see your life flash in front of your eyes, but instead a horrific situation you had no control of and an overwhelming amount of fear through your body. The man pulls out a gun and leans over me, and then everything turns black. Hours later, I woke up next to the service drive and it was dark out. I was out of it. Everything felt like it was moving, as though I was on some kind of psychedelic drug. The reality of what happened hits me more and more. I started thinking, where's my cousin and his fiancée? Are they dead? I started crying as I was walking. Every time I saw a car or a person, I'd duck into some bushes and fear the people who robbed me would return, all while being in pain and unsure if I had been shot. I walked a mile up the road to get past the Detroit border and into the suburb community of Detroit. I went into a store and explained what had happened and said I don't know if I had been shot, but I need 911 immediately. Moments later, cops came and I was still shook and confused. I was afraid to say what really happened in fear of having my name on a police report where a gang could find me. I told the cop I was jumped by a group of white kids in their city, and I told the cop, "Look, I don't care about a police report. I need an ambulance." The ambulance arrives and takes me to the hospital, my face covered in bruises with a distinctive bruise shaped in the outline of a gun. They ran a CAT scan on me and told me I had bleeding on the brain and that it could grow and I could die from it. They had to transfer me to another hospital because they didn't have the neurosurgeons. I spent a week in the hospital from my injuries. 2 days into my stay at the hospital, my cousin showed up with his fiancée. That's when I learned he had ran to a gas station to call the police, and his fiancée had been pistol whipped also and had a lot of stitches on her forehead. This story is 100% true and was the scariest moment I have ever experienced in my life. Since then, I don't go to the ghetto and I don't talk to people I don't know. I also just want the listeners to be aware that the drugs that were being purchased were not mine, nor was it with my money. At the time, I lived with my cousin and he had trust issues. My option was to go with him to get a bag or sit in the rain outside until he came home. This is the only creepy, scary-ish thing that's ever happened to me in my life, which is why it probably stands out so much in my memory. In hindsight, the location and general isolation probably made it much scarier than it was, but at the time it felt like I'd stumbled into the opening scenes of a full-on horror film. Just over 10 years ago, I was fresh out of college and had moved back to my parents' house for the free food and rent for 9 months or so before I was leaving the state for graduate school. My parents are super chill and gave me my own space in the house, but being a 22-year-old single guy and living at a house in the sticks is certainly not ideal. They had recently moved about 40 miles south of a major Midwest city, but I didn't have any other option, so I started looking for some work more to pass time than to save up some money. Summer turned into winter and I still hadn't found anything solid. But by then I desperately needed to spend more time out of my parents' house, so I took a part-time gig doing some light bookkeeping for a small business owner guy that my dad knew. I didn't really want to do it since it didn't pay much, was short-term, and wasn't even a real office setup, but again, since my parents lived in the middle of nowhere Midwest, think acres and acres of farms, I knew I had limited local opportunities to make some cash, and this guy was going to pay me under the table as well. About that same time, a friend of mine in the city said that if I just paid him $200 a month and helped him clean up, he'd basically let me crash in his living room until I was ready to move out of state. That was all I needed to hear. I took the job. So my dad's family had a construction-type business. They helped out with building and stuff, but it was ultimately more focused on renting out a few bobcats and large augers they owned. Also other various drills and then odds and ends like generators and other low-level construction or farming equipment that someone in the area couldn't afford to purchase but needed to use from time to time. This was a small mom-and-pop type thing where everyone knew everyone, and the office only opened on days when someone was coming by, and was generally a mutually beneficial situation for the business owners and the locals. Since I had minored in a business-adjacent area and my dad recommended me, they trusted me to go in there about 15 through 20 hours a week and check the file and rental forms, make sure nobody missed a payment date if there was a payment plan in place, answer an email or two discussing prices and availability, etc. Super easy gig. The old building where I worked was almost about, I think, 90 years old at the top of this little hill, and the downstairs used to be an old country bar until the late 70s when the family bought it cheap, cleared out the bar and fenced off the property to use it as a parking lot to store all their rental equipment and gear. I could generally come and go as I pleased, work any hours I wanted as long as the work got done. So if things were slow and there weren't any rentals for a couple days, I'd usually go in after 7 and stay until around midnight or 1, since I knew I'd be alone and could listen to loud music and take my time and all that. The office where I worked was on a second floor of the building above the old bar and looked out into the long driveway. From my seat I could see out the window and once or twice saw a family of deer or raccoons scamper by, and I always glanced out when I saw movement since it was very noticeable. It was incredibly remote. Very still and quiet. So if something unusual occurred or something felt off, I definitely noticed it. One night during winter it had snowed a few inches and my dad told me to stay because the roads were bad. But I had an old SUV and more than that really wanted to get out of the house, so I just went to work at about 8 p.m. and was going to stay until just after 1. I always left the gate open at the bottom of the hill since, believe me when I say there's nobody that ever showed up at night since we were literally in the middle of nowhere. I think the nearest occupied house was about 2 miles down the road, and to even turn onto our short road you had to only be coming to our specific building and probably know it was there beforehand. It was a locals only type of thing and very small, since the family had inherited a lot of money, we're pretty sure, and kind of did this whole rental thing on the side. Basically, someone would never just get lost and end up at our building. So I'm jamming all the way to some Fall Out Boy. Everyone makes mistakes when they're young. And having some coffee and kept glancing at the snow outside here and there, since our worn oranges streetlight reflected onto the ground in the gate, causing the light to shine off the snow in a really cool, dare I say pretty, way. At one point around midnight, I went downstairs to the big bathroom to do my bathroom business, and then came back upstairs and got settled into my work. I probably did about 5 minutes of work when I glanced outside and saw a huge imprint of something fresh in the snow just below the light. It seemed like it must have been a huge dog or a substantial animal that had just rolled around on the ground there on its back or something. Since I didn't notice it just 15 minutes before, it had happened while I was in the bathroom or maybe when my back was turned, since I would have seen that type of movement for sure. I shook it off and assumed a dog or maybe even a small farm animal, this was common type in that type of area, had gotten loose, and maybe was attracted to the light or something. Who knows? At around 2 in the morning I was leaving, and as always got out of my car to lock the gate up, and to be honest I had pretty much forgotten about the imprint in the snow. But when I looked down I was shocked to see that it wasn't just some disturbed snow, but it was undeniably the imprint of a human-made snow angel. If you don't know what a snow angel is, it's kinda when you lie on your back in the snow and push your arms and legs back and forth, so when they get up it looks like the outline of an angel. I used to do it back when I was a kid, so I 100% knew for sure that's what it was. And it was deliberately made underneath the light post. But it wasn't from a kid. It was from a very large person, or at the very least a normal-sized adult wearing tons of layers of big winter clothing. I looked up and saw what I already knew. That whoever had made this snow angel could easily look up and have seen me through that window. So they must have waited for me to head downstairs to make this angel. I definitely would have seen or heard someone drive up to our building, even if I was in the bathroom, so I know someone had to have walked deep into the freezing cold snow for a few miles, stopped in front of our building, and then do a snow angel in the small amount of time I wasn't sitting in front of my desk window. I glanced around for tracks in the snow and saw that there was one set that led to the nearby woods to the right of the building. So it was clear the person didn't use the road, but instead came from the opposite side, which made me instantly uneasy, since that side was just trees and darkness for miles and miles. I was definitely a little freaked out once I realized that someone had just been this close to me secretly in the middle of the woods, and I looked around but I didn't see anything amiss at all, and now just wanted to get the hell out of there. When I got back in my car and drove a few feet, I realized my boss would probably be there in like 4 hours and might see the snow angel and assume I did it, since he probably assumed I kept the gate locked when I was there. It wouldn't have been that big of a deal at all, but I was young and felt like I might be made fun of by him if nothing else. They were manly men. I liked books. So I opened the gate back up really quick, ran over and kicked the snow around it so it hid the angel, locked it up again, and went back to my car. Also, I should note this is really what happened, but I almost lied here and said something else since it seems fake. Since I assume the average person wouldn't just get back out of their SUV and not just flee their car because they're embarrassed about a snow angel. But at the time I was insecure and cared a lot about what others thought. So unfortunately, that is what I did. Also, I wasn't exactly fully terrified at this point, though it was certainly unsettling. I just thought it was really weird and it could have been an illegal hunter, even though hunting at night in the cold didn't make much sense. Either way, the imprint was made 2 hours earlier and I assumed they were long gone. But that's when I heard it. When I was getting into my SUV, there was the loudest high-pitched laughing coming from the woods. It almost sounded like a fake laugh, like the Witch and Wizard of Oz or something. Like someone was doing it fake on purpose to show they weren't scared of me or how I'd react at all, since I knew they were laughing at me on our property. It was close enough that I knew they could probably see me, but I couldn't see them at all since other than the street light I was under, there was no illumination. After a few seconds of laughing, they stopped, and then it was just silence everywhere except for my heart beating through my ears. Then the laughing started again, though louder this time. more like screaming and laughing combined. I sort of froze for like 5 seconds, listening in panic. Now, I spend a lot of time in that area, and I know what coyotes and foxes sound like at night with their high-pitched screeches during mating season, so I can't completely logistically rule that out. But to me, it honestly felt like it was an adult man trying to emulate a woman's laughing. Like someone was deliberately trying to make a fake scary shriek laugh in order to scare someone. Well, it worked. After that 5 seconds, I immediately filled with adrenaline, got in my car, and drove the hell away from there as fast as I could without sliding off the road. Back at home, I was up all night trying to figure it out and told my parents the story when they woke up. After talking about it, we all decided it was one of two things. It was either my brain somehow convinced itself that the snow formation was an angel shape, when in reality it was just caused by some animal, and then the snow tracks and the laughing were just a coyote or red fox. Though I don't think that's what it was. What I truly believe is the second thing, which is that some local was out walking around for some reason and decided to mess with me. I didn't have any close friends left in that area that would do this, and if they did, they certainly would have brought it up to make fun of me for speeding away in terror. I found out later that the nearest house was a super old couple, so I highly doubt it was one of them. Which means that whoever it was went out into the woods in the night in the freezing cold just to mess with a stranger. I don't have any mental issues or a family history of them, didn't do drugs. I drank socially at the time, but certainly didn't that night. I also don't believe in the paranormal, so I never once gave that a thought. In my heart, I know someone was out there. I worked out there another 6 weeks or so and never had a single issue. Though I knew where my boss kept his gun, and I always made sure it was there when I started my shift. And I certainly always locked the gate from then on. Thinking back about this experience that night, the part that freaked me out the most was that he had to have waited around for me to leave for about 2 hours just to do that laugh. He didn't know me. I could have been that crazy type of person to get mad and try to find him and attack him, yet he didn't seem scared or seem to care when he tried to mess with me. For some random dude, this is probably a story he tells from his point of view to make all his friends giggle hysterically. But for me, that dude, the one I called Angel in the Snow guy, the one with the laugh I'll never forget. Let's not meet. This was 2 through 3 years ago in India, and my father and I were driving home from a wedding. I don't know how much y'all know about weddings over here, but this was a 3-day event that involved the entirety of 2 middle-of-nowhere-nothing villages. It was a huge deal, and we were the only white people the majority of these folks had ever seen. So beyond the bride and groom themselves, we were the best guests. This meant near constant attention, no relaxation or any time to ourselves, and sleep came in the form of a concrete slab of a bed with a thin blanket over it, nestled snugly in between apparently every drunk uncle the village could hold, all passionately arguing for hours about something in Hindi. I think it was maybe the music, which also constantly blared from concert-sized speakers through the whole village. It was safe to say by the time we left the wedding we were already extremely sleep-deprived and out of it. This isn't even the fun part, though. Through an odd chain of events that isn't totally related to this story, while driving home on the single-lane road that had traffic in both directions, dodging donkey carts, groups of scooters, and other drivers at about 120 kilometers per hour, 72 miles per hour for us freedom uniters out there, we get in a head-on collision. I remember realizing what was going to happen a few seconds before it did. Closing my eyes, loosening my body, making sure my tongue would be okay, and then bam. The world turned upside down, and then again, and one more time. Our car flipped 4 times, landing upside down in an overgrown field near the spot of the accident. The other car was mostly gone, and what was left of it was still on the road. Glass was everywhere. My dad was unconscious, my lehenga was ripped to shreds, and there were suddenly voices all around me. I remember being extremely confused and dazed. And I hurt. Why did I hurt? Dozens of people had apparently stopped to flip the car back over to help the American tourists out. A few people pulled me out through the left-hand broken window and immediately went back in to help my father on the driver's side. I, extremely confused, exhausted, and scared, most likely concussed, I later found out definitely concussed, wandered over to the road on the other side of the demolished car. I could hear a siren in the distance. An ambulance? Cops? I didn't pay attention. Where were my shoes? Suddenly a man had his arms around my shoulder and was ushering me to an unknown white car a small distance from the wreck. "I will take you to the hospital," he said. I asked where my father was and a few other questions. He mostly ignored me. "He is fine, come on." He pushed me forward, and in a daze I followed, asking about my things, my shoes, my dad. All I had was my phone, which was still in a death grip in my hand. He ignored me. "Do not worry. Hurry, get in the car." I did as I was told, though I remember asking a few more times about my shoes. I was barefoot and limping. I remember being focused on my right foot, how it wouldn't work, basically ignoring the guy guiding me away from the accident and the rest of the people. Why did it hurt so much? And where was my bag? The man urged me forward some more, promising that my things were fine. He had them already. Just get in the car. I was barely paying attention, slowly following. Where was my dad? At that point, I guess the man decided I wasn't moving fast enough. He wrenched my phone from my hand, maneuvered me into the back seat, and slammed the door behind me. He was walking around to the driver's side when an ambulance pulled up. I struggled with the door, saying I'll get into the ambulance instead, that my dad must be there. And where were my things? "No!" He slammed the door again, blocking it this time. "Be quiet." At this point, I started crying and was still confusedly trying to open the locked door, blubbering that I needed my things. He insisted he was helping and to shut up. Shut up, shut up. He rushed around, opened the driver's side door, and was about to get in when I heard an almost roar-like sound erupt to my left. Suddenly, my father was there, bleeding, limping, ignoring the chaos all around us, and angrier than I've ever seen him. "Get my fucking daughter out of your fucking car!" He grabbed the man, who was almost halfway in the vehicle at this point, and threw him onto the ground, unlocked the back door, and rushed around to pull me out. "Dad, where are my shoes? Does he still have my phone?" I obviously asked to thin air, as my father was already back a few feet away, shouting, hands around the man's throat, demanding my phone. With a terrified look, the man pulled it out of his pocket and threw it several feet away, causing my dad to drop him on the pavement in one swift motion and bound after the device. At that point, the man hurriedly climbed into his car and sped away while I made my way to the back of the waiting ambulance, still not really processing what had just happened. My dad materialized on the bench next to me a few seconds later, my cracked phone in hand, and enveloped me in a huge hug while saying how scared he was. The paramedics moving all around us, securing everything and preparing for the drive to the hospital. Everything after that is a story for another time. But to the random Indian man who most likely tried to abduct me from the accident, let's not meet again. I met Lucy for the first time when she fell asleep on my arm on the bus. When she woke up, she gave me a really weird look before shambling off the bus. I figured she was weirded out that I didn't wake her up sooner, so I kicked myself for being a creep and went on with my day. Can't win 'em all. I was thrown for a hell of a loop when her whole friend group was sitting by my usual spot on the bus the next day. Being an awkward teen, I wasn't about to turn down any kind of positive attention. I got to know her friends and ended up on good terms with her before I realized I hadn't asked her name. I'm hard of hearing, so I didn't hear her when she said her name. Lucy, right? Yeah. Lucy and I had your typical high school courting process. That is to say, she was overwhelmingly forward, and after a few weeks I got the hint. As we were getting close, Lucy would fixate on learning about my past heartbreaks and finding out about my personal life. I'm a serial oversharer, so I really didn't mind talking about myself, but she would constantly butt in saying how fucked up things were and that she'd kick my friends' asses for hurting me like that. I was weirded out. Even at 16, I knew that was cringy and I was going through my emo phase. The thing that really bugged me at the time was that she'd ask so much about me, but she would never say anything about herself. It made me feel shitty always venting and never helping her out. During this time, she missed a few days, and I let another girl sit by me since it was an overcrowded bus and I didn't think it mattered. When Lucy came back and saw me with another girl, you'd think she was shot. She just about ran to the seat behind us and started going off. I can't remember what exactly Lucy said, but the other girl never talked to me again after that. Once her rival was gone, Lucy reclaimed her spot next to me and all was sunshine and rainbows. Nobody ever asked to sit in Lucy's spot after that. Lucy always had a crude sense of humor, but after a while things started getting hurtful. She would take jabs at my insecurities, and any time I got upset about it, she would give me shit for not being able to take a joke. These jokes usually stopped just shy of outright insulting me. When Lucy wasn't breaking me down, she was super affectionate. She would sleep on my chest while we rode home on the bus, and she'd even talk about herself from time to time. I don't remember the first time she hit me. It seems like something that would have been burned into my memory. Some kind of cinematic moment in my life. Honestly, it all just blended together after a while. I know it started off small though, flicking me and playful slapping. By the end of it, she would elbow me in the ribs for telling a bad joke. It didn't register as anything abusive until she slammed me into a wall while we were walking through the hallway after class. I told her a shitty joke and she shoved me so hard into the wall. She laughed because of the sound I made before shoving me again. People were going through the halls with us, but they didn't do anything. Sometimes I wonder what they thought of me. I didn't dump her after the hallway incident, but I did start standing up for myself. We started getting into a lot of fights after that. Of course, they only ever ended in one of two ways. She was right or it was an honest mistake. I tried to break things off a few times around that time, but every time I did, she had a new sob story that I hadn't heard before that made her actions totally understandable. I let it get in my head that she was some tragic soul and that I could help her. I convinced myself there was something noble about taking the abuse, and nobody I knew tried to step in and stop me. I finally got the nerve to dump her after 3 major things happened within a 3-week span. First, I found out she was taking pictures of me while I wasn't looking and posting them online. The weird thing was that I only found out because she showed me. It felt gross seeing a bunch of nearly identical pictures of me not facing the camera. The way she showed me was worse. She seemed excited, like I'd be happy she invaded my privacy. The second weird thing happened when I tried to wake her on the bus. After about a half hour on my chest not saying anything, I nudged her shoulder since we were at our stop, and she just got up, looked me in the eyes, and told me she wasn't asleep. Combined with the pictures, this seemed really weird to me. She didn't try to be cute or romantic or anything. Just, I pretend to sleep on you sometimes. Like, what the hell? The breaking point came when she was showing off some award she got from school. There was something off about the award. It didn't have her name on it. Oh no, it had a name. It even had a picture of her smiling on it. The problem is, it wasn't addressed to Lucy. You can't imagine what I felt when I found out I didn't know my girlfriend's name. A few days later, we got into our usual fights and I broke things off. Lucy always was the persistent type. She would sit a few rows behind me on the bus and stare at me while I went to my car after getting off the bus. Looking at her wouldn't make her stop. It felt like she wanted me to know she was watching me. One day when she got on the bus, she looked me right in the eyes for a solid 20 seconds while she walked past me to her new seat. I'm pretty sure she was expecting me to say something to her. The next year I graduated and got a retail job. End of story, right? I thought so too. It was the start of Christmas season and I was working cashier that night. Lucy came into the store I was working at. Random chance. It had been a year and a half since we broke up at this point, so I wasn't happy to see her, but surely we could pretend it wasn't weird. She gave me the look the squirrel on Ice Age gives his nuts. She grabbed something from the front and went right into my line. She didn't say a word to me, but she wouldn't break eye contact and she was swaying like an excited toddler. It hurt to look at her. I rang her up silently and waited for her to leave. Then I looked at the other cashier for support and he told me she was giving him weird vibes. I got this really bad gut feeling after she left. Lucy became a regular at our little shop. She would come in and creep out my coworkers, and she never really tried to hide what she was doing. One of the other cashiers mentioned how often she came in and asked her about it when she was checking her out, and she said she was visiting me. She didn't say my name, but she described me. After that, whenever she showed up, someone would make a note of it on the radio. She was usually in one of the areas bordering my workspace. I heard about her a lot more than I saw her, so I think she was hiding from me. She never got banned from the store despite many complaints because the managers were penny-pinching assholes who would sell any one of us out to get sales up. I know Lucy was responsible for at least one resignation from my workplace. Someone who looked like me caught her staring a few times and heard how often she came. After a while, the stress just wasn't worth minimum wage. The last time I saw Lucy at the store was a little over a year ago now. I was hanging out with one of the girls in the back while we were loading up the carts with stuff we had to stock. We were right by the back entrance, so you could see right in from the store proper. I left to put up the stuff in my cart, and when I came back, I saw her. She was standing about 40 feet from the back entrance, still as a statue. I froze when I saw her. I watched her stare into the back for what felt like hours before she suddenly turned and walked briskly away. The girl I was talking to was still in the back when I got back. She was a lot more awkward after that. The girl quit 3 days later, just about crushing my ribs when she hugged me goodbye. She hated her job, so I'd like to think it didn't have anything to do with Lucy, but I don't know. I left the store not too long after that and got a job that didn't involve customer service. That wasn't the last time I saw her, though. Over the summer after taking my new job, I had a mental breakdown. I convinced myself that I was unlovable and that Lucy was the only person I could possibly be with. I left the house without any conceivable plan to find her. With the stars in the sky lit by street lamps, I saw her. She was with another girl. I got so close I could almost touch her before I snapped to my senses. I thought about her stalking me at the store, and I realized I was becoming her. I ran home and cried that night. The last time I saw Lucy was last week. I was walking home from work and decided to stop for dinner. I thought I saw her in line, but convinced myself it was someone else. I ordered and sat down to eat. I was looking out the window while I ate, and she took the table between me and the window I was looking out of. She was with some guy that looked vaguely familiar. Maybe a school friend? She was sitting at an angle, so she was half looking at him, and every few seconds she could look right at me. I know it was her. She changed her hair. It looks an awful lot like mine now. After I finished, I went to the bathroom because I felt sick. After washing my hands, I looked into the mirror and I felt like I could die. It hadn't occurred to me before, but I was wearing my work uniform, complete with the company name on my hat in big letters. She was reading my hat. Lucy hasn't been to my current job yet, but I'm sure she'll turn up eventually. I'm moving soon, so I'm just hoping I'm not here anymore when Lucy turns up. Lucy's been a part of my life for the last 4 years. We dated for 4 months in high school and she keeps turning up. I wasn't a paragon of mental health before I met her, but I feel like she broke me as a person and I'll never forgive her for what she did to me. Since her abuse and her stalking, I've developed serious trust issues, get painfully nervous leaving my house, and people who show interest in me immediately put me on edge. I've tried to date since everything happened, but I just can't. I'm too much work at this point, so I've decided I'll stay single until I can work through my issues. I live in a fairly rural small town in the northeast of England. It's surrounded by countryside and smaller villages. Because of this, there's very little serious crime. Worst that happened that I can remember was a stabbing around 8 years ago, and in more recent years a friend of mine had the shit kicked out of him because he was full of drink and 2 teenagers were looking for a punching bag. He came away with a bunch of bruises, but otherwise he was fine. This is just to give you a sense of the place I live so you can understand the situation a bit better. I live right next to the bad part of town, the part where the majority of the crime happens. There was even one bloke that dumped half a rabbit on the doorstep of a corner shop as a prank. So it's a pretty rough area. The downside to living next to this area is you hear a lot of things during the night. Having lived in a city for 3 years while going to university, I got used to the constant noise, the sirens and traffic. So when I finally returned to the comparatively quiet town, it took me a long time to readjust. Which meant I heard a lot of strange things, and on occasions saw things far stranger. So with my difficulty sleeping after the first few nights, I lie in bed hopelessly trying to sleep. I should explain there are 4 mundane typical noises to hear in this town. The clock bell ringing every quarter hour, teenagers thinking they're cool blasting their music past their bedtime on their way home, teenagers in general being loud, and drunks. Whilst failing to fall asleep, I hear voices. I go to take a look out the window and watch these people walk past. Pretty standard. Next, a drunk shouting about how he's gonna clock someone's head in. And then finally, right before I went to sleep, a random man walking home alone, presumably after having a couple drinks himself. A few days go by with more mundane noises. But then I heard a scream. It sounded like it was coming from a little girl. She sounded upset, like her mom had scolded her for something. I then heard shouting and the screaming continued. Then both sort of trailed off and stopped. I suspected that it was a really tired child whose irresponsible parent had kept them up for too long. It wouldn't be the first time I've heard something like that whilst here. So I continue on, night after night, trying to sleep. Nothing interesting truly starts to happen until a week later. I'm playing Sims 4 at what would be around 1:30 a.m. and I hear a guttural scream that I can't figure out where it's coming from. The sound was either reverberating too bad or it was from the road adjacent, behind the houses in front of my own. Either way, I lost interest when the screaming stopped after several seconds and I couldn't figure out where it's coming from. 2 nights pass. Once again I'm playing Sims 4 when I hear screaming again. This time much closer. Close enough that I should have been able to see it if it weren't nighttime. We don't have a lot of streetlights on our street, maybe 1 or 2. There's a good 20 meters or so between the streetlights where it's pitch black darkness. I'm looking and trying to see things the best I could, but it was no good. Which brings us to today. I'm climbing into bed and I hear a bike ride past. I take a quick look out the window but don't see any sign of a bike anywhere. But whilst I'm staring out the window, I see a man step out from the darkness in the middle of the road. He looks like he's just walking down the road and I don't think there's an issue. Until he stops in front of my house. I quickly turn off my lamp and hide from sight. The street lamp I mentioned earlier is directly opposite my house, so the light shines directly into my room, so watching from the darkness isn't an option for me. but it heavily silhouettes anyone facing it. As I lean to see if the guy's gone yet, to my horror, I see him at my garden fence and I can only presume he's looking directly at my window. I panic and take cover once again, listening carefully for footsteps that would indicate he had left. After around 5 minutes or so, I hear them. But to my terror, it sounds like they're walking up the steps and into my garden. I'm too scared to look, but after mustering up courage and strategy to keep myself in the dark, I do. He wasn't there. But I know what I heard. 3 footsteps towards the entrance of my front garden, 4 steps up some stairs, and finally 3 steps to the left and onto gravel. And yet he was gone. No sound of gravel or footsteps. I waited a couple more minutes, but I didn't hear any noises from within my house. We have a 1-year-old, very excitable dog called Dana that would bark the roof off of this place if he came through the back, and I would hear him coming through the front because I'm directly above the only 2 entrances, and I would hear him either breaking a window or a door. So I'm sure he's gone, but I don't know why he was here, and I can't help but feel like he may pay the house more visits. Update number 1. I heard footsteps and took a look outside and saw him walking out from beside my house and out of my garden. It looks like he's gone for now. I mentioned what was happening to my parents and they got in touch with the police. My parents believe he may have been casing the place. I'll update if anything else happens. This happened a long time ago when I was younger, and I have a really bad memory. This is just me recounting the memory to the best of my ability and what I was told. I also want to preface by saying that this story takes place somewhere in Indonesia, where it's almost commonplace to have maids in your household. When I was younger, I had a strong relationship with my extended family. To me, it was normal to be close with extended family. And when I mean extended, I don't even know how they're related to me. In particular, I was close with my grandaunt's family, calling her Grandaunt Sheila, whose daughters/in-laws were like my big sisters. Being the eldest child, I liked being babied by them since I was always expected to be the big sister for my little brother. This is important for later. I was maybe 11 years old or younger. Neither my parents or I remember exactly when it happened. I just want to say, as a kid, I loved milk. I still do, though I tend to stick to skim milk now. When I was younger, I had a favorite local brand that had the usual strawberry flavor. The brand was called Ultra Milk. It was always cool that I was drinking something pink. Unbeknownst to my parents, a gift basket had shown up to our doorstep and the maids had taken the gift thinking it was a present from one of my mom's friends. My parents had even seen the gift basket and didn't think much of it. It was full of fruit, sweets, etc. The usual kind you would send somebody maybe on a special occasion. It should have been weird that there wasn't a special occasion. But another weird part was that usually gift baskets had a card or something to indicate where it had come from. But there was no indication from who it came from. But the maids had overlooked it and my parents didn't notice at the time. They had assumed the head maid had checked it through. She didn't. In the gift basket, there was my favorite tiny carton of favorite milk, even strawberry flavored. I had lessons with a tutor and oftentimes the maid accompanying me to the lessons would bring me snacks or food since the tutoring would take a few hours. I was at my tutor's house and she was teaching me about the homework I got today. When I got thirsty, I got my carton of milk to take a sip out of it. I was ready to take a sip of the extremely sweet artificially flavored strawberry milky goodness. But something was wrong. It didn't taste right. I don't remember what it did taste like, but I knew it was wrong. I remember describing to my parents that it felt like I licked the bottom of a foot of a metal framed chair that I had in my room at my desk. It tasted awful. Thinking that maybe it was spoiled. My mom had warned me about drinking spoiled milk and how it could really upset your stomach. I immediately, without swallowing, grabbed some tissues at the table and spat out the mouthful into the tissues and was surprised to see sort of weird metallic beads in it. Like metal, but it was liquid. I have never seen anything like it, and I was confused. My tutor was even more confused and horrified that I spat out a strange metallic substance from my mouth. I didn't really understand what was going on, but my tutor asked to take the carton of milk where I had tried to drink from and told me to continue working while she went to investigate. Apparently, my tutor and her head maid went outside and poured a bit more of the milk onto the tissue, and there was more of this weird metal liquid in there. She asked me if I drank any of it, and I told her that maybe I took a small sip and swallowed it before I realized that something bad was in there. After that, my tutor apparently called my mom and told her that I had been possibly poisoned. I went home without finishing my lesson, becoming slightly concerned that maybe something was wrong. I went home and I don't really remember what happened after that. There wasn't a poison center in my country and no emergency services that would really respond. Third world country and all that. So my parents took me to a doctor to have some blood tests. I remember being pulled out of school. My mom wanted me to stay home from school for the next few days, which was great for me. No one told me the severity of the situation, and my mom just told me that she wanted me to chill at home for a while. No school? I get to have fun? No way. So I did. I stayed home and watched Avatar: The Last Airbender on DVD while my parents were fretting over the idea that I might have been poisoned by mercury. The gift basket, which had already been taken apart and stored for eating later, was all reassembled and my parents tried to go to the police with it. But they really couldn't do anything since we literally had no leads on where the gift basket came from since it had no card and the police really couldn't care less about our situation. Again, third world country. I don't really know what happened other than I was pretty cool with staying home and playing. My life at home wasn't perfect. Got some issues with my parents. But they were really nice during this time, so I enjoyed it a lot since I didn't really understand. I think my parents kept a lot of things from me to keep from getting scared. My parents even took me overseas to Singapore, even taking the liquid found in the carton with them in a tin or whatever to show the doctors there, where I got tested some more and didn't seem to have signs of any poisoning. I didn't swallow enough of it. I'm not really sure if it really was mercury. No one ever told me, but at the end of the day, everyone was glad that I didn't drink enough of it to get affected by whatever it was. Now to get into the suspect part. My parents later told me that they had a sneaking suspicion that it was possibly that Grand Aunt Sheila who was the one who tried to poison me. I didn't know this at the time, but around that time of the incident, Grand Aunt Sheila was found to have stolen gold and jewelry from my parents' stores for years, worth thousands. My parents were furious and wanted to report her to the authorities, but my grandma, her sister, loved her too much and insisted just cutting contact with her. Since then, Grand Aunt Sheila had seemed to want to enact vengeance over being caught and has been trying to get back at us. My mom had warned me that I couldn't play with big sisters, Grand Aunt Sheila's daughters, anymore since they did something very bad, and to never get into a car with them if they showed up at my school. But it didn't click into my mind until now. Thinking back, Grand Aunt Sheila was close enough to me to know that I loved drinking milk, and maybe tried to hurt my family, even if it meant hurting her grandniece. We could never confirm it was her, but Grand Aunt Sheila has continued to be a thorn in my family's side for years now, though my parents have learned a lesson and ensure that whenever we receive a gift basket, they have to have a name on it. My grandmother doesn't believe her sister did it though, but my parents firmly believe that she was responsible. But we had no proof other than her horrible character. We've received weird gifts like black seeds and hair that was supposedly some sort of witchcrafting thing. Witchcraft and sorcery is a popular thing in Indonesia, believe it or not. We assumed that this was all from Grand Aunt Sheila, who still lived in the same city as us. It only made sense. My parents never brought me Ultra Milk brand again, which I was okay with since that moment spoiled the Ultra Milk brand to me. I was reminded of this story while drinking strawberry milk the other day. different brand. I'm no longer living in Indonesia. Not even in the same country as Grand Aunt Sheila. I begrudgingly earn a living repossessing bank collateral in the form of motor vehicles. As you can probably guess, most people I deal with are not too happy to see me. For some background, I am not your typical repo man by looking at me. Most guys I work with are over 6'3", 200 through 300 pounds, bald with a beard. I know it sounds specific, but it really holds true in my experience. I, on the other hand, am 5'11", 155 pounds, but I do have a beard. On to the story. I was out working during the day and checking a retail location for a vehicle I'd been searching for. The address I was checking was located in a large mall area. I glanced in my rearview mirror to see a red Ford Focus behind me. He made a few of the same turns I did, but I didn't think twice about it. After the 7th or 8th turn that he mimicked, I decided to pull into a parking spot. I figured he would either move on or come to talk to me if that was his goal. I noticed he was on the phone in my rear view. I parked the truck and watched as the car parked about 50 feet away from me. Okay, fine. I noticed the man driving the Focus was staring and pointing at me as he spoke on his phone, so I decided to ask what his deal was. When I approached, he got out of his vehicle, which was alarming, so I backed off and didn't get any closer. I leaned my head out my open window and said, "Is there a reason that you're following me?" He moves his phone away from his ear, covering the microphone, and yells, "Yes, you're harassing people on private property. The cops are on their way." I told him that was fine and I would wait around to speak to the police. He yelled some more unintelligible nonsense as I put my window up and sat pretty waiting for the police. A few minutes later, a cruiser shows up behind me. The officer approached my window and we spoke about the situation. I told him that I'm permitted on private property unless I'm explicitly asked to leave by someone who owns the property or works security, which he agreed with. Long story short, the police told me I was good to go and asked me that I not engage this man as I left. I complied and planned on moving on with my day. About 20 minutes after all of this, I glanced in my rear view to see the same Focus driving a couple cars behind me, so I parked again out of frustration. I immediately exited my truck and lit a cigarette. The man driving his car screeched up beside me and exited it without putting it in park, rather putting it in neutral. As his car begins to roll away, he turns away from it, screaming at me about violating his rights to privacy and harassing the public at this mall. I calmly told him that I was already cleared by the PD and I was losing patience. I told him he needed to leave right then before I called the police. It was at this point that his vehicle struck the concrete base of a light pole and stopped. He started screaming and saying that I crashed his car. I told him I had dash cam footage that would negate that claim. That's when he charged me. Now remember, I'm not a big guy, but I've dealt with plenty of confrontation at this job and this guy did not appear coordinated at all. I stepped out of his path and guided him to the ground, telling him to stay down while I leave and to leave me alone. I got in my truck and left. Looking back, I absolutely should have called the police again, as I've gotten the officer's cell phone number and badge number. This story all comes to a head 2 nights later in a bizarre turn of events that genuinely scared me. At this time, I had just gotten married to my lovely wife and we were living in our little 1-bedroom in our hip little suburb of a major Midwest city. It was a Friday night and I decided to go grab some beers for the wife and I to enjoy after a long week. As I'm leaving the store with our booze, I saw a maroon Ford Focus in the parking lot, seemingly unoccupied. I made a mental note of the coincidence given the bizarre ordeal a couple days prior, but didn't think too much of it. As I pulled into my apartment's parking lot, the Focus pulled in behind me. I hadn't noticed it following me until this point. I live on the 3rd floor, so I decided I was going to hustle up the steps just in case it was the same guy and he'd stalked me or something in order to exact his revenge for whatever perceived transgression I'd bothered him with. My plan didn't work. He followed me to my patio where my wife was waiting, again unbeknownst to me. I was apparently not feeling very observant that night. That's when this guy snuck up, crouching behind our small fence. Neither of us knew he was there until he said something, still hidden from view. Pretty girl. I snapped to my feet and began to look around when I spotted him. I knew instantly it was him. I immediately ordered my wife to go inside, lock the door, and call the police. When I approached him, he drew a small switchblade and pointed it at my belly. I began to back up with my hands up, saying something along the lines of, "We don't have to do this. What do you want?" He told me he wanted to call my wife back outside. But that wasn't going to happen. I'd rather be stabbed than expose her to this man, so I told him as much. He lunged at me with the knife, grazing and cutting my side as I attempted to grab and redirect his forearm. Then he went to the ground where he lost his knife. I got some knees to connect to his head when the police lights became visible and I heard shouting. Long story short, Buddy was arrested on site, and I provided the badge number and PD of the officer from work a couple days prior in order to corroborate my claims. I decided to press charges, and as far as I know, he's awaiting a court date. I'm sure I'll be involved in it. I was 15 years old, and back in those days, you'd usually catch my friends and I at the big AMC movie theater. It's a huge theater. Kind of reminds me of an airport almost, and it was a popular hangout for kids that age on the weekdays. I remember going to the movies one night with my friends, and a group of guys approached us. We started chatting and flirting as you do at that age. They said they went to one of the local high schools. One of the guys I was talking to eventually asked me for my phone number, and I gave it to him. I was naive and thought this was harmless. These were the days before cell phones were ubiquitous, so I gave him my home phone number. He called me maybe a day or two after that, and we talked for a bit. We had a few more phone conversations here and there before he asked me on a date. As we made plans to meet, he told me that he needed to tell me something. He admitted that he wasn't actually 16 or whatever age he said he was, and that he wasn't in high school. He was 22. I fell silent, trying to think of my response. But there was more. Not only was he 22, he had been in prison and was recently released. Why? Accessory to murder for being in a car when his friend shot someone while driving by. I still remember the feeling of being frozen in fear. I calmly told him that I didn't want to talk to him anymore and to please never call me again, and hung up. After I hung up, the phone immediately started ringing. I picked up, and before I could even say hello, this man that had called back was already screaming at the top of his lungs into the phone. I can't remember exactly what he was saying, but it was along the lines of, "Don't you ever hang up on me," calling me every name in the book. So I hung up again, this time leaving the phone off the receiver. I remember being so scared to tell my parents because I didn't want them to be disappointed in me. They were always so proud of me for making good decisions. It was my fault after all, giving some guy I just met my phone number. So I didn't say anything at first. The calls kept coming, but to keep my parents in the dark, I usually made sure I was the one answering the phone when it rang. He told me that he put my home phone number into a reverse phone directory and found my address. He would call and say things like, "I like your sister's new green car," to make sure that I knew he was watching the house. Around this time, I developed a fear of being home alone. I couldn't be alone for even a minute, so if my parents and sister were gone, I'd call a neighbor friend to spend time with me. One night my parents were in bed, but my sister and I were up late watching TV. We saw a car pull into our driveway and sit there with the lights on. I couldn't see who was in it, but I knew. After that, everything stopped. I remember thinking how crazy it was that he had done all of that and then he just disappeared. Maybe a year or two later, I was sitting at home watching the finale of an American Idol. It's funny how the little random details you remember when something significant happens. And the phone rang. The caller ID said it was coming from a correctional facility. Confused, I answered it. It was a collect call from you-know-who. I couldn't believe it. I obviously didn't accept the call and hung up. Never heard from him again. I told my parents about this years later, and they said, "No wonder you were so scared to be alone." I should have told them at first because it could have escalated even further. I started my freshman year of college at a university in my hometown that's pretty nice. I'm not going to share too much about it, but it has a smaller amount of students, but enough that you really don't run into people often. I lived on campus and I was only 17 at the time. I had Tinder, of course, as I was fresh out of a relationship and looking to experience new things in college. I matched with this one boy, Asher, who seemed nice enough. Pretty socially awkward, but I never really minded because I have anxiety issues myself and I'm really sympathetic to it. Because of that, I ignored a lot of warning signs I shouldn't have. We texted for a while and he seems really nice and caring. He wanted to know a lot about me, which I wasn't too keen on sharing, but I told him the basics and we texted kind of regularly. He lived on campus as well and invited me to hang out. At that time, things didn't seem too sketchy, so I was completely down. When I first met him, that's when things started to get uncomfortable. We hung out in his dorm, which was pretty standard overall. I got cozy with him on his couch. I'd say almost cuddling, but not quite. Still really standard. When we started talking more, I realized how uncomfortable things really were. He kept making comments that just put me off, but I tried to ignore them. Things like, "I've never cuddled with anyone before. Sorry if I'm doing it wrong." And so many comments about he already liked me a lot and wanted me to stay forever. Weird word choice, but whatever. He's just trying to be nice. I'll let him down easy. I ended that hangout pretty quickly for some false excuse and went right back to my room. He kept texting and professing how much he was into me, and I told him sorry, but I wasn't looking for that kind of a relationship, so I don't want to keep things romantic. A bad lie, but I'm very non-confrontational and didn't want to be mean. That's when things started to get really weird. He sent me this long paragraph saying about how it was okay I didn't want a relationship now and that he'd wait for me and save his virginity for me. We had never talked about anything sexual. I had never even really told him I liked him or flirted back. I just never turned him down. It was one of the creepiest messages I'd ever received. Unfortunately, that was just the start of all the weird things to come. He wouldn't leave me alone even though I kept trying to de-escalate things, and I kept running into him all over campus. I wasn't sure how he suddenly was nearby when my classes ended, and I wasn't sure why suddenly we're both in the dining hall at the same times, even though I hadn't changed my regular routine. But I tried to brush it off. Definitely a mistake. I ended up turning him down completely because I was getting creeped out and couldn't figure out how he wasn't understanding that I didn't want anything romantic or sexual with him. He started guilt-tripping me, telling me about how he was going to kill himself and no one was ever going to love him. I've been in a manipulative relationship in the past, and I recognized that behavior right away and shut it down. I told him I couldn't be friends with him, and in my head that was that. He didn't reply for a while, but when he did, all hell broke loose. I was luckily out of town at the time for a concert, so that made me feel a lot better. He went off, sending me paragraph after paragraph about how horrible of a person I was and how I was a slut and needed to get put in my place, etc., etc. Regular R nice guy things. I could handle that. I just ignored it. Then, once the regret set in, he made it his mission to win my love however possible. He apologized profusely, telling me how he couldn't be all alone and how I was his only friend and how much he loved me. Whatever. Terrible, but I didn't care about that. Then, I guess to prove his dedication, he did the creepiest thing yet. First, he told me he was outside of my room. We did not live in the same dorm building, and you can't get into the building unless you live there. I don't know who let him in. I wasn't there and my roommate was out, so that was okay. I texted back at that point and told him to leave and how wrong and creepy that was. And he pulled out his last resort. He just sent me screenshots of my contact in his phone. On Apple devices, you can fill out tons of information and have a notes section. Everything was entirely full. He knew my home address, my room number on campus, my parents' and brothers' names, my pets' names, my schedule. It was terrifying because I'm a fairly private person. My Instagram is my only social media and I do not share that much of it. I don't think I'll ever find out how he discovered all that about me. I blocked him on everything right away and reported him to the school. The school did nothing at all. I still see him on campus and he still tries to approach me when he sees me. I always duck and run. It's worked so far. This happened in January, a year and a half ago, on my way to work one cold, wintry Friday morning. I had a rough start to the day. I remember waking up in a panic as I realized I was holding my phone in my hand and had been hitting snooze on my alarms for the last hour. I wasn't even giving them a chance to sound. Apparently, as soon as my phone started to vibrate, which it does a second or so before the music starts to play, I would hit the side button to silence it. I was exhausted. I had already worked Monday through Thursday, 10-hour days that typically turn into 12s at that time of the year, and I had just found out that I was pregnant the week prior. So I was even more tired than normal, and this type of behavior was very unlike me. I'm always on time to work. I don't usually work Fridays, but once a year we have our annual mandatory training for all staff members. It's definitely not a day that can be missed or one to be extremely late to. So I quickly throw on some clothes, tie my hair up into a ponytail, brush my teeth, and then out the door I went. I had 25 minutes before I had to be there, so I didn't even let my car warm up. As I pulled out of my driveway, I remember thinking that my dad would kill me if he knew. He's a mechanic, and that was something he's always preached the importance of. I finally got out of the neighborhood, hit the highway, and noticed that my gas light was on. Another annoyance that would cut into my time, but I decided I would stop once I get off on the exit as I had a few minutes to spare. So I did. I pull my car up to the pump and turn it off, hop out into the freezing cold to get the gas started, and quickly jump back in. There's a guy about my father's age pumping gas into his white work truck right in front of me, but I didn't really pay him much mind. Those trucks were everywhere near my workplace at this time, as it's near the river where all the bridge construction had been going on. I'm texting my friend from work and letting her know where I am when I get this feeling someone is looking at me. I look up and make eye contact with the work truck guy. He quickly looks away just as I hear the gas click off. I get back out and don't think anything else about it, and then hop back in ready to go to work. At this point, I probably had about 5 minutes left, which would have been plenty considering the proximity. I press the start button. Shit, I thought as I did it again, only to hear the same sound. What do you know, my car won't start. Battery's dead, and for the second time that morning, I thought of my dad and his advice. If I would have just let it warm up, I wouldn't be having this problem right now. I try for a third time hoping it's the charm, but it's no use. The guy in the work truck notices at this point. He starts making his way towards me, so I step out of my car. He asks me if I'm having car trouble, and I tell him that I think my battery's dead. He tells me that he can help me, but that he doesn't have any jumper cables in his particular truck. He does, however, only work right down the road. He's on one of the bridge crews and has a set there. He says he'll run to get them and come right back. I tell him he doesn't have to do that, but he says he doesn't mind at all. I think about it for a second. My husband's at home already asleep at this point. He works third shift, and I don't really want to wake him if there's no need, and my dad's already at his job. I remember thinking that he probably has a kid my age somewhere, one who he would hope someone would help in this type of situation one day, that he's just probably a father trying to help, and so I say okay and thanked him for his help. He said no problem, that he'd be back in a couple of minutes and left to get the jumper cables. I usually have a set in my car, but had loaned them to my brother the week before and he hadn't returned them yet. As I'm waiting, I call my boss to let her know what's going on and that I would be in as soon as possible. She offers to send someone out there to help, but I tell her about the work truck guy and that I'll call her right back if this doesn't work. By the time I hang up, he's back with the cables and we get my car started back up again. We let it run for a few minutes and make small talk. That's of little importance, like typical strangers do when they try to fill the silence. It's during this time he asks me if I'm a nurse. Immediately I'm alarmed because I'm not wearing any scrubs. I think he can see the shock on my face because he quickly said that he noticed my license plate when he was pulling back in. I laughed in relief and slight embarrassment as I remembered that my license plate is in fact one of those state-issued nursing ones and reply that yes, I am a nurse and that I'm actually running late for work. He asks if I work at the hospital up the road, to which I reply that no, I do not. Now, he's the one that looks confused because where else would a nurse work, right? I don't want to give too much away. I'm still a woman and I watch the news, and I feel a little uncomfortable with my questions. But I don't want to be rude. So I say, oh, I work at a facility not far from here, and I just leave it at that. I mention again how I'm running late and he unhooks the jumper cables. I thank him and again we both get back into our vehicles and drive away. I let him pull out first and then I proceed to take a roundabout way to work, just in case he was watching. I felt kind of silly, but you never know, right? I finally get to work and jump straight into the training. I honestly don't think about what had happened that morning again except here and there when my coworkers asked a few questions in the break room during lunch. The long day finally comes to an end and we all head out. As I'm walking towards my car, I see a piece of paper shoved down into the driver's side window. I stand there and look at it for a second, thinking of that guy from the morning, and then glance around the parking lot. I don't see anything unusual and remind myself that he didn't know where I worked. I laugh for being so paranoid because it's probably a note from my best friend who actually does work at the hospital a few blocks over. We leave each other notes occasionally if we see each other's cars we drive by. I started it back when she was going through a rough time the year before, and it just kind of became our thing. As I'm sure you guessed, the note wasn't from her. It was from the work truck guy from that morning. I don't remember it all word for word, but most of it I know I'll never forget. It made my skin crawl and thoroughly freaked me the hell out. It listed his phone number at the top with an arrow pointing to it, and it said, "Call soon. Love." It said that he felt we had this connection, one of two souls, and that he wanted to continue getting to know me. That he knew the reason why he was at the gas pump in front of me that morning was so that he could find me because the Lord knows he had been searching for me so many years now. That he couldn't just let me slip away. We just couldn't ignore fate like that. No, not when it had been made as clear as it was that morning. I dropped the piece of paper like it was on fire, felt my heart drop with all my panic and paranoia that came over reading it. I was so freaked out that I immediately called my mom, my dad, and my husband. I didn't want to drive home. What if he followed me? Did he not see the wedding ring? How did he even find out where I worked? He literally had to have driven through about 20 other medical facility parking lots just to find my car because I watched him drive off in the other direction and never saw him turn around in my rear view. Trust me, I was watching. My work building is kind of hard to find too, with it being off the main road and on a side street. especially from a man that lived a couple hours north from here, as he told me earlier during our small talk. He wouldn't have been familiar with the surrounding area enough to just come upon my car like that. I didn't walk in or out of work by myself for months after that. Not until well after the bridge was finished. It's always nighttime when I arrive at work, and for that part of the year when I leave, so there's no way in hell that I was going to walk across the dark parking lot by myself. I've never seen him again, but that hasn't stopped me from feeling like someone is watching me at random times. That type of paranoia just kind of sticks with you. If only I had just listened to my dad's advice and let my damn car warm up. But that's a mistake I have not and will not ever make again. I can guarantee it. My name is Forrest. I know it sounds like a really country name, but I was born and raised in a very suburban/urban area. I grew up specifically in Atlanta, Georgia. This is the story about my first NDE. NDE means near-death experience, by the way. This happened back when I was in high school during my sophomore year. At the time, I was 16 years old and my girlfriend was 17 years old. One night I was at my older cousin's house for a party that he was hosting. I think he was about 19 at the time, and I don't think the party was for anything special. I just think he threw it for the sake of throwing a party. As the party went on, my dumb teenage self decided that it would be a good idea to get fucked up on some champagne, beer, and liquor, which somehow eventually led to me taking a few drugs later on that night. I can't remember exactly what I took, but I think I had a few bars of Xanax, some Percocets, and a few Oxys. I'm sure I did a lot more stuff, but I just can't remember as of right now. By the time the party had ended, I was super messed up, and I ended up making a huge mess. I eventually blacked out, and when I woke up, I was laying in the upstairs bathtub without a shirt or shoes on, and my older cousin, my girlfriend, and two of my good friends were shaking me and yelling at me. They helped me out of the bathtub, and they showed me the mess I had made in the house. Let's just say it looked like a tornado had ransacked it. My girlfriend, two friends, and my older cousin decided to just put me in bed while they dealt with cleaning the mess, as I was obviously far from and I wasn't in any condition to clean the house. So my girlfriend walked me to a bedroom. As soon as we entered the bedroom she had walked me to, I immediately ran over to the bed and passed out on it, not even bothering to change at all or tuck myself in or even say goodnight to my girlfriend. I was out completely. Now here is where the actual near-death experience starts. So I ended up overdosing sometime in the night, and at one point I stopped breathing. This is what I experienced when that happened. I was just having a normal dream about being at school and getting in trouble, but then the dream transcended into what I can only describe as purgatory. Everything in the dream suddenly faded to complete pitch blackness. I hear this low rumbling sound, then a bright round light began to appear above me. The light eventually fully absorbed me, and I began to hear a loud repetitive thumping sound. It almost sounded like a heartbeat. I then started to hear a loud ringing all around me. I felt cold, really cold, like absolutely freezing cold. The fact that I was only wearing what I was wearing in the real world at the time, which was literally nothing but a pair of jeans, that's it, only amplified how cold I felt. I felt sadness, despair, terror, guilt, anxiety, and numb all over at the same time. I felt absolutely miserable and mortified. I felt genuinely depressed. I don't know why, but I just did. After a while, I then began to feel pressure all around me. I don't really know how to describe it. The pressure eventually moved to my chest, and my torso started aching. My whole body then began to ache. I was then pulling out of the light and back into pitch darkness, and everything was completely silent. I then felt a sudden burst of pain, soreness, warmth, and energy in my chest. Then I was suddenly on the floor of the room. My girlfriend was leaning over me with her hands on my chest, pumping it, and my older cousin was on the phone with 911. Later on at the hospital, my girlfriend even said that when she discovered me early that morning, she thought I was completely dead. I had no vital signs at all. My skin was super pale looking, almost like to the point where it was completely white. And when she put her hands on my chest to perform CPR, she said that my skin was absolutely freezing. She said that it felt like she was touching a block of ice. According to her, I was cold just like a corpse. Husband. I later went on to overdose 3 more times during high school, with my girlfriend having to be the poor soul to do CPR on me and every time save my ass from the consequences of my horrible mistakes. I'm now 20 years old though, and my girlfriend is 21 and we're still together. I haven't abused substances since my last overdose, which happened when I was 18 years old and in my senior year of high school. I'm proud to announce that I've since overcome my past drug addiction with the help of rehab and my girlfriend, and I've been doing very well for myself since. If there is any piece of advice for me to give, it's to never ever 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 abuse drugs. I mean never. When I was in high school, I was told this chilling story by my drama teacher, Skip, that had happened to him years before. He was absolutely sincere, and it was told to me in private, so I do believe that it occurred. One evening sometime in the 1980s, Skip and his wife were driving back home after a night out. He noticed another car trailing close behind him, following the same route he was traveling. Turn after turn, the suspicious vehicle continued to follow, closing distance and matching speed when Skip attempted to lose the pursuer. Suddenly he was blinded by its headlights in the rear view and its horn blared at him again and again. Skip and his wife were now terrified by this unknown person or persons and feared for their safety. They knew they couldn't lead this obviously hostile or potentially dangerous person to where they lived and instead chose to drive to the nearest police department. When they arrived at the precinct, the terrorizing vehicle was surprisingly undeterred by the police present, and it stopped when they did, inches from their rear bumper. Skip's wife bounded from the passenger door and quickly entered the police station. Skip stayed behind and watched in horror as the driver exited his vehicle. It was a lone man, apparently very irate, his shirt drenched in blood. Skip was paralyzed in sheer terror and his stomach sank as the man approached his car. Then suddenly his wife was back, bringing with her a group of policemen who subdued the enraged stranger. The truly horrifying details and acute degree of the danger was yet to be realized. Soon after his arrest, police searched the man's house. There they discovered the man's wife, murdered at his hands, her body mutilated and her entrails spread across his backyard. The man that pursued Skip and his wife was an extremely disturbed and delusional psychotic. He had brutally killed his wife just before initiating the car chase. The reason he chose Skip as his target was simply a mistake interpretation of Skip's license plate, BAN 357, as a political statement about gun control which the man disagreed with, and it triggered his violent rage. I was in New York for New Year's Eve going into 2019. For reference, I'm 17 years old, 16 at the time of this event, and on this trip I was with both my parents and my 2 sisters, aged 14 and 13 at the time of the event. We were taking the 32nd Street subway back to where we were staying in Jersey City, New Jersey. If you've ever been on a subway in New York City, you know that there just aren't trains that take you straight to your destination. There are multiple stops, and our stop in particular happened to be the less busy and least amount of people getting off. This holds some significance later on in this story. As we got onto the subway, my mom, youngest sister, and I split from my dad and my other sister. We were in the same car, but several seats away. Again, if you've been in a New York City subway, I probably don't need to tell you this, but it is very busy on those subways and all types of characters walk through those subway doors. This doesn't faze me as 1, I was born in Newark, New Jersey and grew up near Orange, New Jersey, 2 areas that weren't necessarily the safest and have some of those types of people, and 2, I have some friends and family members that have gotten themselves in bullshit. Doesn't really make them bad people, they're just doing things I don't agree with. I still love them though. On the subway, standing alongside my mom and sister, I noticed a homeless man looking at my mom and sister. I don't think too much of it. My mom and both my sisters are pretty attractive. What got me a little creeped out was that he was staring a little too long and hard, almost predatory. I also noticed that this man had 2 braids on either side of his long, otherwise unkempt beard, which I found kinda cool to be honest. I gave him occasional side glances and then noticed his attention shifted to my sister, who bear in mind is 3.5 years younger than me. At this point I was less creeped out and now I was just pissed off. I swiftly but as low-key as possible got her attention and asked if she noticed him staring. Without giving it a second, my mom jumps in and asked why the man was staring at my sister. I told them both not to look back, and to my surprise, they finally listened to me about something. I wasn't about to start something with this guy because I was with my entire family, but I still wanted to let him know that I wasn't about to just watch him stalk my sister. I promptly stepped into view so he could see us both and stared right into his eyes. I can't lie, it was strange to do this. It could have been weird for him too, but I didn't want him to be uncomfortable. He simply had a look of malice, but his demeanor definitely changed after he saw me. I figured if it came down to it, despite being 5'8" and him being nearly 6 foot, I would probably whoop his ass because we were roughly the same weight. That was until I noticed him digging into his coat pocket periodically. It was almost as if he were adjusting something. As crazy as I might sound, this also didn't stop me from staring right through him, but I was now kinda threatened. Okay, not kind of, pretty damn threatened and suspect. As the stops passed, more people got off the train, but my stare down with this man continued. Obviously, I'd occasionally look away because I was scared at this point, and his eyes just told me that he had nothing good planned. On top of this, he had his hand in his pocket moving something around, and I had no clue if it was a weapon or not, but I still stood tall and strong. Our stop approaches, and I came to the realization that this man had just gone past several stops and was now coincidentally at our stop, having looked at my sister up and down the entire trip. The doors open, and to my surprise, he rushed off the subway. I must have really scared him off, right? Nah. My 6'2", 260-pound dad came up next to us along with my other sisters so they could get off with us, and the pedo must have seen him. After the guy left, I felt like a true brother. We ate dinner as a family, and I forgot about it. Well, the story doesn't quite end there, otherwise there would be no point in telling this story. Of course, I was watching the news the next morning in a state I don't even live in, not even watching the damn news in my own state. My mom was in the room too, kinda overhearing news stories. I will never forget when the news anchor broke a story about a man who was wanted by the NYPD for the sexual assault of 2 girls. One while on the subway and one who was coming off the subway in New York City. They showed surveillance footage of the perp, and wouldn't you know it, this dude from last night's ride home was on our hotel TV. My mom and I just looked at each other, both in apparent shock and disbelief. We didn't say anything, but my mom lectured my sisters about being careful in crowded areas where a lot of people were around. I had to double check to make sure it was him. Sure enough, the guy on my TV had braids in his beard, something they actually mentioned the guy had. It was also mentioned that he was armed and dangerous, and anyone who sees him should contact the police immediately. A little hard to do if he's a subway drifter and the New York City subway system has either no service or 1 bar on 3G service, but I guess the intent was good. A lot of things about this just made me realize what was actually going down, and it truly made me the most uneasy I've felt in a very long time. First off, he was staring at my sister, who is pretty, but obviously not 18. This made me question his intentions with her. Second, he waited for our very stop, but probably ran off after seeing my dad. This means he was likely waiting for us so he could do God knows what. As I stated before, I was probably around his weight and definitely had better hands than him, so I could probably handle him. That is, unless he was armed, which leads me to the final thing that put me off about this whole situation. This man was fiddling with something in his pocket, and as much as it is possible, I don't think it was a bluff. Someone living the lifestyle he lives with no real protection and nothing to lose would likely be armed with a pocket knife at the very least. What would have happened if my dad and other sister never came to get off with us and chose the other door? I never really know or want to know. I don't know if the cops caught the man. I'm hoping they did and that he's off the streets for a long time. As a preteen about 10 or 11, I was at the mall with my mom and grandma. We were walking around shopping from store to store when I noticed a man out of the corner of my eye. I got the feeling he was looking at me, so I turned to look at him, made eye contact, and sure enough, he was looking straight at me. I thought to myself perhaps he was interested in the same clothes I was looking at on the rack in front of me, so I walked over to my mom in the ladies section. We soon left the store and I forgot all about the man. About an hour later, we decided it was lunchtime and we made our way to the food court. I told them I was going to use the restroom and wash my hands. They acknowledged me and told me to meet with them in the center area at the table. I walked down the adjacent hallway that led from the food court to the men's and women's restroom. I walked into the men's and it was empty. There were 2 urinals and 1 stall. I decided to use the stall even though I really needed to go number 1. Just as I turned to close the stall door, the restroom door quickly swung open and the man I had seen earlier swooped in and came towards me. I hastily but hurriedly pushed the stall door and locked the latch. The man pulled and tugged at the door and tried to force it open. He shook and jiggled it with more and more force and determination. This whole time I kept saying to myself, "Please let this be just a nightmare." But reality quickly forced me into defensive mode. I stood there holding the latch in the locked position with both hands when he uttered, "Open the door," in a low and stern voice. I thought to myself that if worse came to worst and he tried to crawl under the door through the opening, I would kick and stomp his face as hard and as fast as I could. As he continued for about another minute or so, I peeked through the crack of the door stall and about froze. My heart was pounding so hard as soon as we made eye contact. I confirmed it was the same man I saw in the store earlier. I prayed for someone to walk in and knew this man wanted to molest me. He told me to hurry up and open the door as he reached up to the top of the door and started pulling the door vigorously. The entire stall was moving back and forth and I was squeezing the lock so hard my sweaty hands were white from the exertion. I remember wanting to cry and scream at the time, but I couldn't give up. Just then, out of nowhere, a group of older guys walked in. There were about 4 or 5 of them, all tall and appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s. I unlatched the door, slipped out and forced myself in between these guys and hugged the biggest one as tight as I could. The creepy guy backed up into a corner as the guys made their way in, but because the bathroom wasn't very big, he couldn't exit until they were all in. They looked at me, quickly looked at him, and they must have seen how terrified I was because they immediately started yelling at him, "Are you bothering this boy?" The big guy I was hugging moved me behind him and put himself in between me and the bad guy. They grabbed him as he tried to leave and shoved him against the wall. They asked me if I was hurt. I told them he followed me into the restroom and then tried to force the stall door open. The bad guy denied it, but I insisted for them to believe me that he was yanking at the door with both hands telling me to open it. More people were now walking into the restroom, and as everyone shifted, the man broke free and ran off. They chased him and I ran to my mom to tell her what had happened. We notified security, who called the police, and we filed a report. The man got away. Fast forward 10 years and I graduate from the police academy and I joined the police department. I swore I would do everything I could to help people in need while putting myself between them and the bad guy. I did this for 20 years and then called it a day to spend more time with my family. Retired and happy, I urge everyone to listen to their instincts. Time and time again, victims have stated they knew something was wrong before tragedy struck. This happened many years ago, but I've just discovered that the person in question has been released from prison. In my mid-20s, I was bouncing around, and after a long, crappy relationship, was most interested in having fun. I was at university, but wasn't the most committed student. I had been working at a restaurant and a hotel, but hated it, and a friend told me about working as a receptionist in a brothel. It's completely legal where I live, and said the money was decent, it fit well with university, and it wasn't difficult, and if the clients were rude, you could just kick them out. Unlike hospitality, where you had to be polite all the time. I found a place that was looking for receptionists and went for an interview and got the job. And it was fine. I mean, not the most interesting job in the world, but it paid okay. I could smoke out back when cigarettes didn't cost $50 a pack, and I could study if it was quiet. And I know what everyone is thinking at this point. Receptionist is code for sex worker, and I promise it isn't. I have no proof, but lying about it doesn't make the story any better. In fact, if I were a sex worker, it might have been an even more interesting story. Sadly, no such excitement in my life. We had regular clients, and they all had reputations of some kind. This guy only books an hour, but always extends his bookings at least once. This guy will pay extra for dirty talk. A lot of it was innocuous. Just information passed between people that we as receptionists always heard about. But some of it was more along the lines of a warning. This guy will try and remove the condom. This guy wants to spank but won't ask first. And then there was the doctor. The doctor had a lot of money and would potentially book multiple workers for a long time. He paid well for reasonably boring extras like fancy lingerie or fantasy roleplay, aka nurses' uniforms. But he had a big red warning sign above his head. The first time he came in, one of the other receptionists warned me, "No one has to do an intro with him if they don't want to. Warn the girls it's the doctor." I called the intro, i.e. I went into the staff room and said, "Intro in meeting room 1," which generally meant that every available worker should go in, say their name, flirt, or whatever. After which one of the receptionists would find out who they wanted to see and for how long. And all the workers stood up. And then I said, "It's the doctor." And all but 2 sat back down. So I immediately asked what the deal is, and they explained that he likes his cocaine. He likes his workers who like or pretend to like cocaine. And he's a neurosurgeon who gets access to weird drugs, and often his cocaine is far from pure. Not cut with drain cleaner, but cut with pharmaceuticals, like amnestics used for surgery. He also enjoyed drug insertion. I'm sure you can fill in the blanks. He was sometimes belligerent if workers refused him, after they'd started the booking. And he was just creepy. When we'd go in to check on him, he'd try and grab us, make us, the receptionists, sit down, and to be clear, I'm not what people consider attractive. Plus, he'd do it to all the receptionists. He'd grab our hands and try to stroke our arms. He had this super intense stare, like a mannequin that couldn't actually make eye contact. I know that sounds weird, but it's hard to describe. It's like he's staring right into you, but also not seeing you at all. His expressions were weird and just didn't work on his face. Like his mouth would smile or move, but his eyes wouldn't change from the intense stare. I guess it might have been the cocaine, but it was deeply unsettling and just made you feel sick. Having said all that, there were a few experienced workers who knew how to handle him, get the most out of him whilst experiencing the least possible risk. It's possible to fake snorting a line. I did not know this before that point, hence giving workers the option to meet the client. I can't remember if he saw anyone for the first time. If I recall correctly, he had a handful of bookings in the time I was working there. We did have strict instructions not to ever let anyone do an out call with him. That is a booking anywhere other than the brothel. Plus, we had a few other harm minimization strategies. Then after a while, one of the workers who was okay with seeing him left to go traveling and no one else would see him. So he'd gradually stopped coming in since no one would intro him. I moved on to receptioning at a different brothel. A new one had opened up closer to where I lived and the pay was better. And he showed up again there. I knew he would frequent all the places he could, until his reputation overtook him. When he showed up at the new place, I told all the workers about him and no one was okay with seeing him. He only tried a couple more times before he abandoned us. A year or so later, I moved on to a different job. I couldn't do night shifts anymore. And I was chatting with a friend from the brothel who said, "Oh my God, did you hear about the doctor? He killed someone and got arrested." And it was true. The doctor had killed a worker who he had seen in his apartment. The worker lay dead in his bed for 2 days. Officially, it was manslaughter, and he also pled guilty to supplying the drug that killed another worker. All this happened because A, he's a terrible dumpster fire human, and B, because one awful brothel manager and owners behind her put profits in front of safety and kept sending workers to bookings with him without giving them full warnings, and specifically sending inexperienced workers, and without keeping them in-house. It later comes out that the medical board had known about his cocaine addiction for many years prior to his arrest and had helped cover up some botched surgeries. It was horrifying to hear about this, and we both spent some time telling stories we knew about him. But then I mostly forgot about it. Then I was chatting with an old friend the other day who reminded me of him, and I got on Google. I found out that he's been released from prison. I hope not practicing medicine, but he could be anywhere now. I always leave my car doors unlocked. Always. No matter where it is, no matter what I'm doing, no matter how long I'll be, it's always unlocked. The reason for this is because I used to live in a really bad neighborhood. There were always robberies. Back then I was a broke-ass college kid. I didn't have shit for a motherfucker to steal. I noticed that some people were getting their windows smashed in on their cars. When I asked around, they told me the cars with the smashed windows were locked. So I left my car unlocked. If they wanted to waste their time looking through it, that's on them. I always kept my car unlocked and never kept valuables in it. A few times it was rummaged through, but I always just cleaned the mess up and moved on. Fast forward to now. I have a closing shift at work about a week ago. I'm a librarian, so I get off at 9 during closing shifts. Not bad, and we all walk out and lock up together. There are 2 parking lots at my library, one on the front where the books are and one in the back where the labs and computers are. Most employees park in the back, but this time I chose to park in the front. I said goodbye to everyone and headed to my car, alone. When I reached it, I grabbed the handle and pulled. It wouldn't open. For a few seconds I was confused. Then it hit me. My doors were locked. Instantly, I was unsettled. I had the feeling I was being watched. I don't know why. Maybe it was just the weirdness of knowing I hadn't locked the door. I looked around, checked my back seat, unlocked it, and jumped in. I started it and tore out of the parking lot. When I hit the main road, there was traffic. It wasn't a lot given the time, but it was pretty slow and kept stopping. I still had a creepy feeling, but it brushed off. I watch too many horror movies. Then, as I stopped at a light, I hear a loud screech and a thump. My trunk had just come open. I waited until I got into a well-lit area to stop. I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station shaking. I made sure there were people around and practically tiptoed to my trunk. Nothing was there, but a few of my things looked like they had been moved to make a person-sized spot. I might start locking my car. And a quick little edit, I have automatic locks on my car door. You open the door, hit the lock button, shut the door, and voila, the car is locked. There's a button in the car you can press to open the trunk. The trunk doesn't open with a key. The button in the car has to be pressed. There's a lever inside the trunk that prevents people from getting kidnapped. You pull it and the trunk is open. Another update as well. I emailed my boss today because I didn't want to call the police unless I had a valid reason. We're going to go over the front parking lot security footage at some point next week and see what happened. Another update. We got the feedback on the video footage. This man, who is a bit off, that comes into my work a lot, got into my car, seemed to tinker around for a few minutes, popped my trunk, got out, looked in my trunk, and closed it. Apparently he hadn't closed it hard enough to latch it, so when I stopped it jiggled open. It wasn't just my car either. He messed with a couple other vehicles. Mine was just the only one unlocked, it seems. This story takes place some time ago. I was around 13 years old at the time. At the time, I was staying with my mom and older sister at my late great-grandfather's cabin in the middle of the woods. It was a dark night around mid-August, and we had been spending the summer there. This cabin has always had its distinct personality. My great-grandfather had built it himself after he finished fighting the war during World War II. The interior is made up entirely of dark wood. The furniture still has the old pre-war Nordic and Eastern European feel to it, where my family's from, and the walls are decorated with old worn-out framed photos of unknown but serious-looking relatives of my family from the past. The house has always had a somehow mysterious, a little offsetting but still calming feel to it. Me and my sister, being curious kids, had just on the previous day looked through some old photo albums belonging to our great-grandparents that we had found in the library. A decision which we both regretted. As it turns out, it was customary back in the days to photograph the dead. And as you could guess, the albums dated after the war were filled with photos of dead bodies sitting or laying around next to their relatives. We went through the album and there were tons of them. From grown-up adults to dead kids to actually babies in tiny coffins. And what makes it worse was almost all of the photos were taken unmistakably right in front of this cabin on the yard. We shivered and wondered if the bodies had been buried here too, but decided in that moment together that we would never ask about it. I mention this photo album detail because it's relevant to understanding why I was already creeped out that night. That evening, me and my sister had decided to sit in the candlelit living room and read horror books together. Because why not? We were staying in an old cabin after all, and it felt atmospherically appropriate. My mom, being a night owl and insomniac, had decided to go for a sauna and shower in the middle of the night. The cabin's wooden sauna is located in the stone basement of the cabin. Another important detail to note is that this cabin is quite in the middle of nowhere of the middle of the forest. There are a handful of neighbors who are at least a kilometer, about half a mile, away. The whole community has lived there for generations and everybody knows everybody. So as a rule, we never had a habit of locking the doors when staying there. The only person that ever locked the front door in the cabin was me, and I always did it accidentally by slamming the door too hard so it automatically locked. So it was midnight. My mom was down in the basement, and me and my sister were reading horror stories in the living room. We were in a mostly light mood, despite both of us feeling a bit creeped out, when suddenly out of nowhere we hear a faint knock on the door. We both jump up. We barely ever had visitors during the day, and nobody ever showed up unannounced during the night at this place. We decided in that moment that we were probably mistaken in feeling spooked out by the stories, and it must have been the wind that was making the noise. But no. The faint, calm knocking came again. Then louder knocking followed. We realized that undeniably there had to be someone out there and they wanted to get in. In horror, we both ran to the kitchen to grab something to defend ourselves with. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find and had a quick conversation with my sister on whether we should go to the basement to get our mom. The knocking continues, and at this time whoever it was wasn't knocking on the door anymore, but they had moved to the curtain-covered window next to the door to knock on it instead. My adrenaline kicked in and I was feeling a little braver, so we decided to walk slowly toward the door and I decided to take a peek out the window. I moved the curtain slightly to take a look, however I see nothing but darkness out there. I closed the curtain and turned to my sister when suddenly somebody tries to pull the door aggressively. We both flinch, but thankfully I was the last person to enter the cabin that evening. The door's locked. At this point in time, it was just us. 2 kids with kitchen knives and some strange person trying to get into our cabin in the middle of the night, and the only thing separating us is a wooden door. At this point, we've had enough spooks, so my sister runs down to get my mom from the basement as I stand shaking by the door holding a big-ass knife. I hear footsteps on the front porch, but no more knocking or attempts to open the door. My mom comes upstairs and she seems to be in disbelief that anyone would be trying to get in at this hour. We all stayed in the living room waiting for more sounds, but an hour passes by and we hear nothing. Until suddenly we hear loud panicked knocking on the door. We all jump at the sound and my mom goes rapidly to the window to open the curtain and check who it is. Suddenly, upon seeing who it is, she mutters, "What the?" and slowly opens the door. We hear her exchange a conversation with a woman whose voice is familiar. We walk over to check who it is and realize that it's our aunt, my mom's sister, who lives on the other side of the county, standing on our front porch in the middle of the night. She looks scared and panicked, and my mom keeps apologizing to her. "No, sorry, you can't stay here. I'll order you a taxi somewhere safe," and closes the door. After some time, we see a taxi arrive and watch her leave with it. Our mom double checks that the door is locked and comes over to us looking worried. We ask her about what had happened, and she tells us that her sister had told her that there had been some dispute and now she's being chased by a handful of dangerous and angry men that wanted to kill her and are trying to track her down. She's been trying to run and hide from them for 2 days straight now. She's always lived kind of a wild life, but this was something new. The part of the story that really brought me the chills is that the aunt claims that she had arrived at our front porch that very moment when we heard the panicked knocking on the door. She certainly had not been standing there quietly for an hour or been knocking on the windows, meaning that whoever the person faintly knocking on the door about an hour before her arrival wasn't her. We have no idea who it was or what their intentions were, but I know that given the extraordinary circumstances, I would reckon it was likely one of the men who was trying to track her down. I still keep thinking back to that night. Whatever could have happened had that door not been locked. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, hit the notification button, and all that good stuff. If you would like to help support the channel, I would really appreciate if you went and checked out my Patron page. You can get yourself some pretty cool perks over there as well. Or you can become a member on the YouTube channel, and the join button should be down by the subscribe button. Get yourself a nice cool badge as well as some other perks. I appreciate you checking out this video, and just know that there's going to be a lot more content coming out, so make sure you have notifications on. And I will catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true. Bad bye.